My name is Amadou Chico Cissoko. Let's talk. Let's talk about failure. I've had a lot of failures in my life, and each story has its own twist. The first one that I always remember was when I was in Europe. I had left Guinea with a scholarship in medicine, and my parents were hoping that I would go and become a very good doctor like my dad. And so I went to Czech Republic with a scholarship, all paid for. All I had to do was go to school, study, get a diploma, and come back. When I got there, my thoughts were different. At that time, I just had a child who was 1 year old, my first daughter, Maria Masire. And I was thinking about her all the time. I was thinking about what type of father will I become? How many years am I going to stay here studying medicine and my child is growing up when I'm not there? And I also thought about my ex-wife then. We weren't married, but we were planning to get married after we had a child. I was thinking, can I be able to stay all these years, without being by her side? What would my life become if I had pursued these 6 years of medicine and I left my family behind? So it was tough. It was tough on one side because I had a family of my own. I was 19. I had a small family that I was building, and I wanted to be able to take care of that family. It was also tough because I didn't have any resources. I was still dependent on my parents. I didn't have a college degree, and these 6 years were going to be what would, confirm me as a doctor and then come back and work in my dad's clinic. But the hardest thing was not even the fact that I was away from my own family. The hardest thing was the fact that I didn't love medicine. I didn't love the study of it. I didn't love the feel of it. I didn't even love the idea of becoming a doctor and being in one same hospital every single day. I wasn't passionate about it at all. So what happened was that as I was studying the language, the Czech language, to become a doctor, it became very evident that that wasn't the path that I wanted to pursue in life. And so immediately I started thinking, what then do I want to become? If I don't become a doctor, what can I become? But one thing that I knew about myself since I was a kid was that I always loved helping other people. I always loved helping people become stronger. I always loved standing up for other people. I always loved fighting the bully. Because the bully in general is someone who likes to, put their own strength and their pressure on other people. And so I always used to stand up for the weaker people and people who are afraid of, those who are bullying them. So I ended up being the bully of the bully. And I always thought to myself, you know what? I can be able to help people become better. So as I was there, I was doing the same thing. I was, standing up for people. I got in a fight because of a friend who was attacked by skinheads when we went out in a club. And I fought back against the skinheads because of this friend, risked my life. They looked for me for many days in the city, and they couldn't find me. But, it was a traumatizing moment where I had to learn to overcome even more fear to keep standing up for other people. So when I decided to drop out of medical school, it was a very tough period of my life because I knew that my parents had high expectations of me. I knew that they had put so much of their hope and their future in me, and invested so much money for me to be where, in Europe studying medicine, to become a doctor. And I was afraid of disappointing them. I was afraid of being rejected. I was afraid of, the criticism that would come with it. But I couldn't stand the school. I couldn't stand the studies of Czech. I was studying Czech language. I hated it. And every single day I was feeling bad, And by the time I was getting to the exams to get into the School of Medicine, I just failed myself. I literally chose all the wrong answers not to succeed. I refused to study, and I put myself in a situation to fail. And that's something I learned later when I became a coach, that you can actually program yourself to fail when you're doing something that you don't love, because you yourself don't want to succeed in it, because if you do succeed, it means you continually have to be doing it. And so I said I didn't want to live a life where I would force myself to fail ever again. So one of the first things I had to do was to decide to leave Czech Republic. And that's when I set my eyes on France. And I said, what I want to be in life, I want to be a writer. I want to be someone who writes stories that are gonna inspire people. I want to be someone who sets an example for other people to follow. I want to be someone who can, be a model and an icon for other people to look up to. And that meant that I needed to pursue what I believed was the best for me. When I decided to drop out of med school, and I shared that with my parents, they were very angry, especially my father. And it became like a sign of rejection. And that was a very tough time in my life where I felt as if I didn't have the support of my parents to pursue what I thought would be best for me. But also I felt like a failure. Because I hadn't succeeded in anything else, this was what my hopes and my family's hopes were on. The fact of actually not doing it was a tough thing. So what happened is I left Czech Republic and I went to Belgium. I had a half-sister who was staying in Belgium. And so I went to stay with her for a while. And I thought, okay, since I'm here in Belgium, why don't I go to, get into a psychology school? I wasn't accepted. Later I came to France. I stayed in Paris for a while. And then I went to stay with one of my friends in Toulon, in the south of France. And there also, I tried to enroll in 3 different schools of commerce and economics, and I wasn't accepted in these schools. All these things I was doing because I needed to find something else to do, because I had dropped out of school, and the beliefs of my parents and friends at the time was that without a diploma you can never succeed. And after failing, in Czech Republic, failing in Belgium, then failing in France, in Toulon, it became very clear that I had to pursue what I really wanted to do. And so I decided I wanted to publish my book. So I went back to Paris. I had a manuscript of about 400 pages of my life, the stories that I had written, the journals that I had kept, my thoughts over the past years that I was in Europe and when I was in Guinea as well. Because by then already I had a certain level of maturity that was a little bit more advanced than my friends, because when I had my child at the age of 18, it became very clear that I needed to man up and to become more responsible. So I shared all these things in this manuscript, and I went to Paris, and without doing any research, without having any contacts, the first person I asked for help was one of my uncles who was a well-known writer in France. And I asked him to read my manuscript. When he read it, he came back to me and said, Chico, young writers, when they start, they generally like to take other people's ideas. And I was like, so what do you mean? He says, well, I think that some of these things you've written are not your own ideas. And that rather than disappointing me, it was like an encouragement. Because in one way, he didn't believe that I could have that type of maturity of thought. But secondly, he didn't believe that, I was ready to publish a real book, that I had, copied someone else's ideas and then put them in my book. And that's what I wanted to publish. And that was a book written in French at the time. And that was very painful, but at the same time it was motivating, because I was like, if I can have thoughts that other people think that I can't have, probably when they'll read the book, they'll be very inspired. So what I did was I continued. I went and I sent my manuscript to about 14 different publishing houses that I found online. I asked them to send me back responses, and I waited. I never got a response from any of them. None of them ever responded. I called some, they never, they said that, I have to wait till they send by the post, and others said that if I don't receive a response, it means I was rejected. And so it was very evident that, despite all these challenges I had gone through to write this book, to travel from Czech Republic all the way to France, I wasn't going to be a writer, according to those publishers. And to be honest, I think they were right. I probably didn't have the story then that, would make for a book. I probably wasn't mature enough to know how the publishing industry works, that you don't just send a manuscript to a publishing house and then you're selected. You most of the time have to be introduced by someone, or you most of the time have to have some sort of traction. You most of the time have to have been, heard of or read somewhere before, either through a blog, or you already have your base of people. That was 10 years ago, and then there wasn't so much self-publishing that you would even think of publishing by yourself. So that's one side. The other side also is that I hadn't had the maturity of life and the experiences like I have now to write a book that would be sold for $1 million, or that would sell 1 million copies. And that was my goal then. I wanted to publish a book that would, I would get paid $1 million, that would enable me to, marry my wife then, have my children with me, continue doing my medical studies or whatever else I wanted to do, and then, and be happy. And I failed. So what happened after is that I was speaking with someone and they told me about coaching. And they said, you sound like a good coach. I'm like, what's a coach? They're like, a coach is, someone who motivates people, who helps them develop themselves. I'm like, but that's what I do on a day-to-day basis. They said, well, then you need to, go to a coaching institute. And so I went online and I found this coaching institute in France, and I called them and I applied. And by that time I had convinced my mom that, since I didn't have a degree and I was not intending to go back to university, why doesn't she invest in me becoming a coach, and then I would come back and work for her as a coach. I would coach her and coach her team and her employees. And my mom, who's been my supporter, in every single project and everything I've done, she accepted. So I went to this coaching institute and I asked them, I said, okay, I want to be a coach. And they said, okay, send us your diplomas, your degrees, your CV. I'm like, I have no diplomas. They're like, well, then we can't take you because we only take people who have finished university or have, who are transitioning from a job. I'm like, I've neither finished university and I've never worked for anyone. So I don't qualify in that sense. But I am a coach because I've been helping people and people are telling me that, what I do is very good. So I insisted and persisted, which is, one of the things that I teach in my book about persistence. And what happened was that they said, yeah, you know what? Go on, come on, we'll interview you. They gave me an interview for about 2 hours. It was supposed to be a 1-hour interview. It ended up being 2 hours. And the person who interviewed me, who's a coach herself, said, you are going to be the youngest coach of France. We're happy to enroll you. Just make the payments and, come and we're ready to start. Right. And that was the first victory I had. The first time I had won in almost 2 years. 2 years going through failure and failure and failure and failure and failure. And for once I had this victory and I was like, wow, finally. So I called my mom. I was so excited. I was telling her, Mom, I'm going to be the youngest coach of France, finally I've been accepted in this thing, perseverance pays off. She was very happy. Then I called an aunt and I told my aunt, I'm going to be the youngest coach of France. And she was like, what is a coach? I'm like, oh, it's like a psychologist. She's like, why are you studying that? Like, you're never going to get a job. There's no one who hires a psychologist in Guinea, right? If people have problems, they go to the witch doctor, to the marabout, they go to their family, but they never really go to someone for help. And so I ignored what she was saying because by then already I was very good at motivating myself from criticism because I had received so much criticism from the time I decided to drop out of med school until the time, that I got into this coaching institute. I had received so much criticism that I had started taking that as my motivation. So if someone would criticize me, I would say, okay, I'm going to prove them wrong. Or if they've criticized me, I would find something in that criticism that would actually motivate me to keep going forward. So what happened next is that I had to find a place to stay in Paris. And if you've been to Paris or if you know about Paris, that you can't get a place to stay even in France if you're a student without having a tutor or someone who would be like, a guarantee in case you don't pay for rent. They'll be the ones who will guarantee for you. So I had to find someone, and the people that my parents recommended me to, people that my parents had helped get to Europe and all that, I went to them and I asked them. Some of them couldn't, some of them didn't want to. They didn't want to take anyone else on their backs, so they just said, they can't. So I found myself again, not being able to find a place to stay, having to look around online for co-sharing apartments or roommates. And a funny thing is, I found a roommate, but this guy was gay, and he wanted to take advantage of the fact that I didn't have a place to stay and try to see if he could, put me in some sort of prostitution so that I can have a place to stay. So I was willing then, to either go and sleep in jail, by beating the hell out of him, or, having to, sleep on the street. And I ended up finding myself the next morning on the street. And I was sitting underneath a bridge. I had no place to stay. I had no money. I had no food. And this guy had asked me to leave his house. And so that's when my mom gave me a call again and said, okay, so how's it going with the lodging? I'm like, Mom, I had found a place to stay, but unfortunately the guy who had, invited me there rejected me, told me to go and find another place. And so now I'm in the street. My mom was so emotional. She was like, wow, my son on the street, that's impossible, finding my son that he has no place to stay. So then she said, okay, I'm calling you back. So I spent that day sitting there under that bridge, asking God, why? Why is all this happening to me? Why am I just failing and failing and failing? And then I could not understand what God had in store for me. Because when you're going through failure, it's very hard for you to know why you're failing. At that time, you can't understand that maybe you chose the wrong path. You can't understand that you chose the wrong people. You can't understand that you had the wrong ambition. You can't even understand what's the lesson to learn from that failure. However, if you don't fail, you'll never learn. If you don't fail, you'll never know, or you never become that person you want to become. You never become that person you're destined to become. I didn't know that I had to go through those things 10 years ago so that I could be able to write this book today that talks about them, right? Write this book today that inspires people about them. Write this book today that actually helps people understand why they're failing and how they can, overcome failure and be a winner on a day-to-day basis. So a few hours later, my mom calls me and she tells me, Chico, I've bought you a ticket. I want you to come home. And I don't want you to be ashamed. I want you to know, even if you come, you've gained knowledge. You may not have gained, a diploma or money or resources, but you have knowledge and experience that can be very helpful. And I told her, okay, Mom, let's have an agreement here. I want to come back. I'm going to learn, just like I've been learning so much about coaching and psychology, I'm going to coach you and your team, as we had in the agreement. And I came back. My whole family considered me as a failure. My grandparents, my friends, my colleagues, my ex-wife's family at the time. And everyone said I was a failure. But my mom believed in me, and I believed in myself that I was going to bounce back. 2 years later, I built the first Agrotourism Retreat in Guinea. 2 years later, no, that was 3 years later. 3 years later, when I came back, despite everybody calling me a failure, 3-4 years later, I built the first Agrotourism Retreat in Guinea. 2 years after I came back, I helped my mom become the Woman of the Year in Guinea through the coaching that I was giving her. She was recognized for all of her work in rural Guinea. A year later, again, I built with some friends the first social entrepreneurship movement. And a few years later, I was selected by the President Obama for the Mandela Washington YALI Fellowship, for the program in the U.S. So I don't regret any of those failures today. I think when I was going through them, they were difficult. When I was going through them, they were challenging. I got depressed. I was smoking a lot of weed. I was, always by myself, in my own paranoia. But with time, I've learned that you can't succeed in life without failing. So hence why I encourage people to fail and learn from their failure. I encourage people to try new things and to push moving forward. There's a quote by Peter Drucker, and I'm going to end with this, is that CEOs who don't take risks end up making about 2 major mistakes every year. And it's the same number of mistakes that CEOs who take risks also make. So if you're a CEO, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a leader, if you're a mother or a father, or a young man or a young woman who wants to achieve something in life, you have to understand that you must fail. You must fail, and you must be okay with failing, because every single failure is going to teach you something that you wouldn't have learned if you just stayed the same. So I encourage you to purchase my book, Start Within to Start Winning, How to Overcome Failure and Start Winning in Your Life and in Your Business. It's going to transform your life, because it's my own transformational journey of how I went from failing in life to being successful. Thank you very much. See you soon.